Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. What happened in Fish Lake National Forest still doesn't make sense. I'm Amanda Wright, and I was 26 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The YouTube channel had been Tommy's obsession for 3 years. Hidden Utah had started as a weekend hobby, documenting abandoned mining towns and forgotten ghost settlements scattered across the state. But when one of his videos about a cursed cemetery went viral, Tommy Chen became convinced he could turn urban exploration into a full-time career. "This is it, Mandy," he said, showing me the email on his phone as we loaded gear into our rented RV. 50,000 subscribers. Sponsorship offers? I can quit my day job and do this full-time. I loved Tommy's enthusiasm, but I worried about his increasingly reckless pursuit of content. What had started as documenting historical sites had evolved into something more dangerous, seeking out locations with dark reputations, chasing stories of hauntings and unexplained phenomena. His audience craved the adrenaline of supernatural encounters, and Tommy was eager to provide them. "What's so special about this place?" I asked, reviewing his research notes as we drove south from Salt Lake City. The file was thicker than usual, filled with newspaper clippings, forum posts, and hand-drawn maps that looked decades old. "Fish Lake National Forest," Tommy said, unable to contain his excitement. "Specifically, an area called the Pando Grove. It's home to the largest living organism on Earth, a single aspen tree that's spread through underground root systems to create an entire forest. But that's not the weird part. He'd discovered references to something called the Shepherds, a group that had allegedly lived in the forest for generations, tending to the aspens like a sacred grove. Local indigenous tribes had stories about people who'd joined the trees, becoming guardians of an ancient ecosystem. Mormon pioneers reported encounters with pale figures who emerged from the aspens to guide lost travelers to safety, then vanished back into the forest. "Most people think it's just folklore," Tommy continued. "But there are modern sightings, too. Hikers talk about meeting helpful strangers who know the forest intimately but leave no tracks. Park rangers have reports of voices calling from deep in the grove, speaking in languages nobody recognizes. The stories shared common elements: encounters with unusually tall, thin people dressed in earth-toned clothing who seemed to appear from nowhere when travelers were lost or in danger. They'd provide aid, food, or guidance, then melt back into the trees before questions could be asked. Some witnesses described them as having bark-like skin or leaves in their hair, but most accounts dismissed these details as tricks of forest lighting." "Sounds like urban legends built around helpful park staff," I said, though Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious. "That's what I thought too," he replied, pulling out a folder of photographs, "until I found these." The images were grainy trail camera shots, obviously taken over several years by different researchers. They showed figures moving between the aspen trees, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that seemed to blend with the forest shadows. In some photos, they appeared to be tending to damaged trees, their elongated arms reaching toward broken branches. In others, they stood in groups, as if holding silent conversations among the pale trunks. "Could be hoaxes," I said, though something about the images made my skin crawl. The figures' proportions were wrong: too tall, arms too long, movements too fluid for normal human anatomy. Maybe. But I found coordinates for a dispersed camping area deep in the Pando Grove. No one's made a proper documentary about the Shepherds. This could be the breakthrough video that establishes my credibility. I should have talked him out of it. Tommy had always been prone to obsession, throwing himself completely into projects until they consumed all his time and attention. The YouTube channel had already cost him one relationship and most of his savings. But I loved his passion, his willingness to chase impossible dreams, and I couldn't bear to be another person telling him to be realistic. The drive to Fish Lake took us through some of Utah's most beautiful country. Rolling hills covered in scrub oak gave way to mountains thick with pine and aspen. As we climbed higher, the aspens became more prominent, thousands of pale trunks creating corridors of white that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. "Look at this place," Tommy breathed, pulling over at a scenic overlook. Below us, the forest stretched for miles, an unbroken sea of aspens that shimmered in the breeze like water. It's all one organism, every tree connected by underground roots, sharing nutrients and information. The largest living thing on the planet. There was something unsettling about that concept. The idea that what looked like individual trees were actually parts of a single, vast consciousness. As the breeze moved through the leaves, creating waves of motion across the forest canopy, it was easy to imagine the grove as a sleeping giant, breathing slowly through 10,000 mouths. Our campsite sat in a clearing deep within the forest, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound between increasingly dense stands of aspens. Tommy had chosen the location based on its proximity to several reported shepherd sightings, though it meant we'd be completely isolated. No cell service, no other campers, no easy escape if something went wrong. "Perfect," Tommy said as we set up camp in the late afternoon light. The aspens surrounded our clearing like pale sentinels, their white bark marked with the black scars of old wounds and new growth. "We'll have complete privacy for filming. No tourists wandering into the background, no noisy neighbors." I helped him unload his equipment: professional cameras, motion sensors, night vision gear, and enough battery packs to run a small film studio. Tommy had invested everything in his channel, convinced that the right content would transform his hobby into a viable career. As evening fell, the forest took on an otherworldly quality. The aspens seemed to glow in the fading light, their white trunks creating a maze of vertical lines that confused depth perception. Every breath of wind set the leaves rustling in a sound like whispered conversations, and shadows moved between the trees in patterns that might have been wildlife or might have been something else entirely. "Did you hear that?" Tommy asked, pausing in his camera setup. I listened carefully. Underneath the constant rustle of aspen leaves, I could make out something else. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been chanting or might have been the wind playing tricks with the forest acoustics. "Probably just the trees," I said, though the sound seemed too structured, too purposeful to be natural. "All that interconnected root system probably creates weird resonances." Tommy was already reaching for his audio equipment, excited by the possibility of capturing unexplained phenomena on the first night. He set up directional microphones aimed at different sections of forest, hoping to isolate and record whatever was creating the sounds. We made dinner on the RV's stove and ate outside, surrounded by the soft sounds of the forest settling into night. As darkness deepened, the aspens became ghostly pillars barely visible in the starlight. The rhythmic sound continued, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to almost nothing. "There's definitely a pattern to it," Tommy said, reviewing his audio recordings on headphones. "It's not random wind noise. There's structure, repetition, almost like a language." I tried to share his excitement, but something about the forest felt wrong. The aspens were too still when they should have been moving, too active when there was no wind. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, tall figures standing motionless between distant trees, but when I turned to look directly, I saw only shadows and pale bark. "Tommy," I said as we prepared for bed, "maybe we should set up the motion cameras closer to the RV. If something's out there, I'd rather know about it before it gets too close." He agreed reluctantly, moving several cameras to create a perimeter around our campsite. The night vision displays showed the forest in green-tinted monochrome, transforming the aspens into an alien landscape of twisted forms and moving shadows. "If the shepherds are real," Tommy said, settling into his sleeping bag with obvious excitement, "this could be the documentation that proves it. First contact with something that's been hiding in these woods for generations." I lay awake, listening to the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant rhythm that might have been chanting, and underneath it all, the sense that we were being observed by something patient and ancient. Through the RV's windows, I could see the aspens swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel, their pale forms creating a hypnotic dance that made my eyelids heavy. I woke to silence. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but the absolute absence of sound that comes when every living thing stops moving at once. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustle of leaves. Even Tommy's breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened to absorb sound. I checked my phone. 3:17 a.m. Tommy slept deeply beside me, his face peaceful in the green glow of the motion camera displays. But on the screens, I could see them. Tall figures stood among the aspens, just at the edge of the camera range. They didn't move like normal people. Their posture was too rigid, their stillness too complete. They seemed to be watching our RV, though the night vision cameras couldn't capture enough detail to make out faces or expressions. I counted at least 7 figures, possibly more hidden deeper in the trees. They stood in a rough circle around our campsite, maintaining their positions with the patience of hunters or guardians. Occasionally one would shift slightly, but they never left their posts or moved closer to our RV. "Tommy," I whispered, shaking his shoulder gently, "wake up, look at the cameras." He sat up groggily, then became fully alert as he saw the displays. "Holy shit, are those—" "The shepherds," I finished. "They're real." Tommy grabbed his main camera and tried to get a better view through the window, but the figures were too distant and the lighting too poor. All we could make out were tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that seemed to blend with the aspen trunks. "We need to go out there," Tommy said, reaching for his equipment. "This is exactly what we came for. First documentation of the shepherds. This could be the most important footage ever captured." "Absolutely not." I grabbed his arm. "We don't know what they want or if they're dangerous. They're standing in a circle around us, Tommy. That's not random. They're surrounding us for a reason." But Tommy was already energized by the possibility of breakthrough content. "They're probably just curious. The stories all say they help lost travelers. Maybe they're trying to figure out if we need assistance." As if responding to his words, one of the figures began moving toward our RV. Its movement was fluid, almost gliding, as if it was floating just above the forest floor. In the green night vision display, I could see it more clearly. Extremely tall and thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body and a face that remained hidden in shadows. "It's coming closer," I said, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. The figure approached to within 20 feet of our RV and stopped. For several long minutes it stood perfectly still, as if studying us through the walls. Then it raised one elongated arm and pointed toward the forest depths. "It wants us to follow," Tommy said, his excitement overriding his caution. "This is incredible. They're trying to communicate." But I noticed something he'd missed. On the motion camera display, the other figures had begun moving too, converging on our position from all sides. What had looked like curious observation was becoming something more organized, more deliberate. "They're not just watching anymore," I said. "They're coordinating, moving into position for something." Tommy finally seemed to grasp the situation's potential danger. He grabbed his phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal this deep in the forest. We were completely isolated, surrounded by unknown entities whose intentions remained unclear. The lead figure began moving again, circling our RV slowly and deliberately. Others emerged from the tree line, becoming visible in our motion cameras. In the green-tinted displays, I could see them more clearly. Tall, gaunt figures dressed in clothing that seemed to be made of bark and leaves. Their movements were coordinated, purposeful, like a pack of predators evaluating prey. "Start the engine," I said, but Tommy was transfixed by what he was seeing. "Look at them," he breathed. "They're incredible. The way they move, the way they coordinate without speaking. It's like they're part of the forest itself." He was right. There was something plant-like about their movements, a flowing quality that suggested deep roots and patient growth rather than animal locomotion. But that only made them more terrifying, not less. One of the figures approached our door and knocked. 3 slow, deliberate taps that seemed to resonate through the RV's frame. The sound was wrong somehow, too deep and resonant, as if the creature's knuckles were made of wood rather than bone. "Don't answer it," I said, but Tommy was already moving toward the door. "We came here to make contact," he said. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Through the window I could see the figure's face, or where its face should have been. Instead of human features, there was a smooth expanse of bark-like skin, marked with the same black scars that covered the aspen trees. Where eyes should be, dark hollows stared with ancient patience. "Tommy, that's not human," I said. "Look at its face. Really look at it." But Tommy seemed entranced by the encounter, unable to process the wrongness of what we were seeing. He reached for the door handle and I grabbed his wrist. "If you open that door, we're both dead," I said. "Those aren't people, Tommy. They're something else, something that's learned to look like people." The knocking stopped. For several minutes we heard nothing but our own breathing and the subtle sounds of the figures moving around our RV. Then a new sound began, a low humming that seemed to come from the forest itself. The humming grew louder and more complex, developing harmonies that no human throat could produce. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language, but something in between that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the nervous system. I felt my muscles relaxing despite my fear, my breathing deepening as the sound washed over me. "It's beautiful," Tommy said, his voice dreamy and distant. "They're singing to us, welcoming us." But I could feel what the humming was doing, dulling my fear, making the situation seem less dangerous than it actually was. The sound was designed to calm, to pacify, to make resistance seem unnecessary. Whatever the shepherds wanted, they were trying to make us compliant. "Fight it," I told Tommy, shaking him hard. "Don't listen. It's doing something to our minds." The humming intensified, and I saw Tommy's pupils dilate as the sound took hold. His expression became peaceful, accepting, as if he'd just received wonderful news. He reached for the door handle again, moving with the slow deliberation of someone under hypnosis. I tackled him away from the door, and we fell together onto the RV's narrow floor. The impact seemed to break the humming's hold momentarily, and Tommy blinked in confusion. "What? Why did you—" Then he saw the motion camera displays and his face went pale. The figures had pressed closer to our RV, surrounding it completely. Their bark-like faces were turned toward us, and though they had no visible eyes, I could feel their attention like a weight. "We need to leave," Tommy said, finally understanding our danger. "Right now." But when he tried to start the engine, nothing happened. No lights, no electrical systems, no response from the ignition. The shepherds had somehow disabled our vehicle, trapping us in the middle of their territory. "The batteries," I said, checking our electrical panel. Everything was dead. The main systems, the auxiliary power, even our phones had lost their charge. "They've drained everything electronic." The humming resumed, but now it carried a different tone, more insistent, more demanding. Through the windows we could see the figures swaying slightly in rhythm with their song, their elongated arms moving in gestures that might have been invitation or command. "They want us to come out," Tommy said. "To join them." "Join them how?" Before he could answer, the RV began to shake. Not violently, but with a rhythmic motion that matched the humming. The shepherds were rocking our vehicle gently, like parents soothing a restless child. The motion was hypnotic, combined with their song, and I felt my resistance weakening despite my fear. "We have to get out," I said, fighting against the soporific effects of their manipulation. "Not to join them, but to run. If we stay here, they'll keep working on us until we surrender." Tommy nodded, though I could see him struggling against the compulsion to simply open the door and walk outside. The shepherd's influence was strong, designed to overcome human will through patience and repetition rather than force. We gathered what supplies we could carry, water, food, Tommy's main camera, and prepared to make a break for the forest. Our plan was simple. Run in the opposite direction from the thickest concentration of figures, try to reach the dirt road that had brought us here, and hope we could make it to civilization before they caught us. "On 3, I said, my hand on the door handle. "Run toward the road and don't look back. Don't listen to anything they say or sing. Just run." I opened the door and we burst out into the night air. The shepherds didn't pursue us immediately. They simply watched as we ran between the aspen trees, their faceless heads turning to track our movement. But as we reached the edge of their circle, they began to move. Not chasing, but flowing through the forest parallel to our route, cutting off escape paths with inhuman coordination. "This way," Tommy gasped, veering left toward what looked like a gap in their formation. But more figures emerged from the trees ahead, forcing us to change direction again. They were hurting us, I realized, using their superior knowledge of the forest to guide us deeper into their territory rather than toward escape. Every path we chose was subtly blocked. Every route directed us further from the road and deeper into the Pando Grove's heart. The humming followed us through the trees, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to make my thoughts fuzzy and compliant. Whenever we stopped to rest or plan our next move, the sound would intensify, forcing us to keep moving to maintain mental clarity. "They're not trying to catch us," Tommy said as we paused behind a cluster of large aspens. "They're driving us somewhere specific." He was right. The shepherds moved with purpose, their coordination too perfect to be improvised. They had a destination in mind, and they were using our fear and exhaustion to guide us there without physical confrontation. The forest began to change as we were driven deeper into its heart. The aspens grew larger and closer together, their white trunks creating a maze of narrow passages that limited our options. The ground became softer, more organic, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps. And everywhere, carved into the bark of the ancient trees, were symbols. Not random marks, but deliberate patterns. Spirals, intersecting lines, abstract shapes that seemed to shift and move in our peripheral vision. Some looked fresh, as if they'd been carved recently. Others were old, grown over by new bark, suggesting the symbols had been accumulating for decades or centuries. "Tommy," I whispered, "I think we're in their sacred space. This is where they live." The humming had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that felt worse than the pursuit. The shepherds were no longer visible, but I could feel them watching from the shadows between trees, waiting for us to reach whatever destination they'd been guiding us toward. We emerged into a circular clearing perhaps 100 feet across. In the center stood the largest aspen I'd ever seen, a massive patriarch whose trunk was easily 10 feet in diameter. Its bark was covered in symbols, layer upon layer of carvings that told some kind of story in a script I couldn't read. But it wasn't the tree itself that stopped us cold. It was what surrounded it. Human figures stood in concentric circles around the great aspen, but they weren't moving, weren't breathing, weren't alive in any way I understood. They looked like people who had been partially absorbed by the forest. Skin like bark, hair like moss, fingers extended into root-like tendrils that disappeared into the earth. "Jesus Christ," Tommy breathed, raising his camera automatically. They're part of the trees." The figures were obviously human in origin. I could make out faces, clothing, personal effects that suggested different time periods. Some wore modern hiking gear, others clothes that looked decades old. A few were dressed in what might have been 19th century pioneer clothing. They were the shepherds. Not a separate species that had always lived in the forest, but people who had joined with the Pando Grove, becoming part of its vast networked consciousness. The tall figures that had surrounded our RV were further along in the transformation, more tree than human, but still mobile enough to interact with the physical world. "They're all volunteers," a voice said behind us. "No one is forced to join. It's always a choice." We spun around to find one of the shepherds standing at the clearing's edge. Up close it was obviously female, or had been once. Her face was still recognizably human beneath the bark-like skin, and when she spoke, her voice carried the rustle of leaves. "You've been guiding us here," I said, surprised to find my voice steady. "Yes. The Grove called to your companion. His passion for documenting the unknown, his desire to find something greater than himself. We've been waiting for someone like him." Tommy stepped forward, his camera forgotten in his hands. "What do you want?" "To offer you a choice," the shepherd said. "The world you come from is full of noise and haste and meaningless competition. Here, you can be part of something larger. The Grove has been growing for thousands of years, accumulating wisdom, experiencing time at the pace of seasons rather than heartbeats. She gestured toward the transformed figures around the great aspen. They chose to join us, to trade their brief, chaotic lives for something eternal and peaceful. They became part of the forest's consciousness, sharing its memories and purpose. What purpose? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. To grow, to connect, to preserve the old knowledge that your civilization has forgotten. The Grove remembers when the first humans walked these mountains, when the climate was different, when other choices were possible. We are its guardians and its memory. Tommy was staring at the transformed figures with fascination rather than horror. They look peaceful. They are. No more worry about careers or relationships or financial security. No more loneliness or fear of death. They became part of something that will outlive your civilization by millennia. I grabbed Tommy's arm. They're not people anymore. Look at them. They're vegetables, living decorations in a forest garden. But the shepherd shook her head. They are more than they ever were as individuals, connected to every root, every leaf, every breath of wind through the branches. They experience the forest as their body, the seasons as their heartbeat. It's the ultimate communion with nature. More shepherds emerged from the trees, surrounding us with the same patient circle we'd experienced at our campsite. But now I could see the progression. Recently transformed individuals who still looked mostly human, older conversions who were more tree than person, and ancient guardians who had become abstract amalgamations of bark and leaf and shadow. The choice must be made willingly, the original shepherd continued. We can't force the transformation, but we can show you what you're missing. The peace, the connection, the escape from everything that makes human life so brief and painful. She approached Tommy, extending one root-like hand toward his face. Where her fingers touched his skin, I saw green spreading. Not infection, but invitation. A sample of what the transformation offered. Tommy's eyes fluttered closed and his face took on an expression of absolute serenity. For a moment, he looked younger, unmarked by stress or ambition or the constant pressure to prove himself through his work. "It's beautiful," he whispered. So quiet. So complete. The green spread further across his cheek, and I could see his pupils dilating as his consciousness began to merge with something vast and alien. The Tommy I knew was disappearing, being absorbed into the Grove's collective awareness. I knocked the shepherd's hand away from his face, breaking the connection. The green faded, and Tommy blinked in confusion, returning to himself but clearly longing for what he'd briefly experienced. "We don't want your transformation," I said, backing toward the clearing's edge with Tommy in tow. "We want to leave." The shepherds made no move to stop us, but their presence felt heavier, more oppressive. "The offer remains open," the lead figure said. "The Grove is patient. It can wait for you to understand what you're refusing." We ran again, this time with no pursuit. The shepherds simply watched as we fled through the forest, their faceless attention following us like a weight. But now I understood their strategy. They didn't need to chase us. The transformation they offered was seductive enough that people would return voluntarily once they'd experienced its promise. Tommy was already fighting the compulsion. As we stumbled through the aspens, he kept looking back toward the clearing, his face showing the struggle between his rational mind and the peace the Grove had offered him. "Maybe we should reconsider," he said as we reached the area where our RV sat dark and empty. "What they're offering, it's exactly what I've been searching for. Purpose, belonging, something bigger than myself. They're offering death, Tommy. The death of everything that makes you who you are." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. The Grove's touch had shown him an alternative to the stress and uncertainty that had driven him to seek increasingly dangerous content for his channel. Why struggle with human ambition when he could simply let go and become part of something eternal? Our RV remained powerless, but as dawn approached, the electrical system slowly came back online. The shepherd's influence weakened with daylight, allowing our technology to function again. We packed hurriedly and fled the forest, driving toward civilization as fast as the rough road would allow. But the damage was done. Tommy had felt what the Grove offered, and no human achievement could compare to that perfect peace. He tried to return to his normal life, editing footage from our encounter, though his cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial moments. But his heart wasn't in it anymore. I keep thinking about them. He confessed a week after our return. How calm they looked. How free from all the things that make life so complicated. I tried to help him process the experience, to understand it as trauma rather than revelation. But Tommy had always been prone to obsession, and now his fixation had found its ultimate object. He began researching the Grove obsessively, planning return trips, talking about the transformation as if it was a career opportunity rather than psychological dissolution. 3 months later, he disappeared. I found his apartment empty except for a note apologizing for his choice and coordinates leading back to the Fish Lake Forest. His YouTube channel posted one final video, footage of him walking alone into the aspen grove, his face showing the same serene acceptance I'd seen on the transformed figures. The police searched for him, but found no trace. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. But I knew better. Tommy had made his choice, trading his chaotic human existence for the eternal peace of the Grove's collective consciousness. Sometimes I wonder if I should have let him go that first night. The shepherds weren't evil. They genuinely believed they were offering salvation from the pain of individual existence. And maybe they were right. Maybe joining something larger than yourself, becoming part of a consciousness that experiences time in centuries rather than years, is a form of evolution rather than death. But I can't forget the faces of those transformed figures, the way their human features slowly blurred into bark and leaf. Whatever peace they'd found, it came at the cost of everything that made them individuals. They'd traded their souls for serenity, their consciousness for connection. The worst part is that I understand the temptation. Life is difficult, full of stress and uncertainty and the constant pressure to achieve and compete. The Grove offers escape from all of that, a return to the simple rhythms of growth and rest and seasonal change. Sometimes, driving through forests, I find myself looking for pale figures between the trees, listening for the humming that promises peace and belonging, wondering if Tommy was right to make the choice he made. The coordinates from his final note are still programmed into my GPS. I haven't deleted them yet. I'm not sure I ever will, because the shepherds were right about one thing. The offer remains open. The Grove is patient, willing to wait for us to understand what we're missing. And sooner or later, when human life becomes too much to bear, some of us will accept their invitation to join something larger than ourselves. The question isn't whether the transformation is real. The question is whether it's worth the price. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of modern life, I'm not sure I know the answer anymore. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Jessica Park, and I was 33 when we arrived at Canyonlands National Park. And it was the worst mistake of our lives. The cross-country RV trip had been planned for over a year. My husband, Mark Anderson, and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary with an ambitious circuit of Western national parks. After 15 years together, we'd fallen into comfortable routines that felt more like roommates than lovers. The trip was supposed to rekindle something we'd lost along the way. "Look at this," Mark said, spreading maps across our dining table in the 32-foot Coachman RV we'd rented in Denver. "We can hit Arches, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, Bryce, and Zion in 2 weeks. It'll be like a second honeymoon." I loved his enthusiasm, though privately I worried we were trying too hard to manufacture romance through shared experiences. Mark was a software engineer, methodical and logical, who approached problems by gathering data and optimizing solutions. I was a high school art teacher, more intuitive and emotional, who believed some things couldn't be fixed through careful planning. Our marriage had been struggling since his mother's death the previous year. Mark had withdrawn into work and routine, while I'd grown frustrated with his emotional unavailability. The trip was my idea, a chance to reconnect away from the distractions of home and career. "I found an amazing spot for our Canyonlands stay," I said, showing him photos on my laptop. A remote camping area called White Rim. Completely isolated, incredible views, just us in the desert for 3 days. The White Rim Road was a 100-mile dirt track that wound through some of the most spectacular scenery in Utah. Most visitors drove it in sections, but I'd found a dispersed camping area at a place called Murphy Point where we could stay multiple nights and explore the surrounding canyons at our own pace. "Looks pretty remote," Mark said, studying the access route. "Are you sure our RV can handle those roads?" The rental company said it would be fine, and we'll have the satellite phone in case of emergencies. Mark's engineering mind craved contingency plans and backup systems, but I was drawn to the idea of true isolation. No cell service, no internet, no escape from each other except what we could find in honest conversation and shared silence. The drive from Moab took us through increasingly dramatic landscape. Red rock mesas and carved canyons created a geological showcase that seemed almost artificial in its perfection. As we climbed toward the White Rim, the views opened up to reveal vast expanses of layered stone that told the story of millions of years in color and texture. "It's like driving through deep time," I said as we navigated the narrow dirt road. "All these layers, each one representing eons of history." Mark was focused on the technical challenges of maneuvering our RV through tight switchbacks and steep grades, but I could see him relaxing as we left civilization behind. The constant ping of work emails and project deadlines couldn't reach us here, forcing him to be present in a way he rarely allowed himself at home. Murphy Point sat on a rocky promontory overlooking the Colorado River, which carved through red sandstone canyons 1,000 feet below. Our campsite was completely isolated. No other campers, no facilities, just a flat area beside the cliff edge where we could park and set up camp. "My God," Mark breathed as we stood at the overlook. "How old is all this?" "The rock layers we're standing on are about 280 million years old," I said, remembering my college geology courses. "But the canyon itself is much younger, maybe 5 or 6 million years." There was something humbling about contemplating such vast timescales while standing in a landscape that made human existence feel like a brief flicker. The late afternoon sun painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, creating a natural cathedral that dwarfed our concerns about marriage and career and all the small dramas of daily life. We spent our first evening setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The edge of Murphy Point offered multiple viewpoints into different branches of the canyon system, each vista revealing new layers of geological complexity. As sunset approached, the rock formation seemed to glow from within, creating colors that no photograph could capture. "I'm glad we did this," Mark said as we sat beside our campfire, watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to just be somewhere, without agenda or schedule." For the first time in months, we talked without underlying tension or careful navigation around sensitive topics. The immensity of our surroundings seemed to put our relationship problems into perspective, making them feel manageable rather than insurmountable. But as the night deepened, I began to notice something strange about the way time felt in this place. It started as a simple observation. My watch seemed to be running slow. When I checked it against Mark's, his showed the same delay. Our phones were packed away to preserve battery life, but the satellite phone's clock displayed yet another time, several minutes ahead of both our watches. "Electronic interference," Mark said when I mentioned the discrepancy. "All this mineral content in the rock probably affects timekeeping devices." It sounded reasonable, but something felt wrong beyond simple technical malfunction. The rhythm of night seemed off, as if seconds were stretching and compressing unpredictably. Sometimes minutes passed in what felt like moments. Other times, brief conversations seemed to last for hours. I woke the next morning feeling disoriented, as if I'd slept much longer or shorter than the sun's position suggested. Mark was already up, studying the canyon through binoculars with intense concentration. "What are you looking at?" I asked, joining him at the cliff edge. "Movement down there," he said, handing me the binoculars. "In the canyon, something that doesn't belong." I adjusted the focus and scanned the canyon floor far below. At first I saw only rock and shadow, the serpentine curve of the Colorado River cutting through ancient stone. Then I caught it. a flash of something metallic, too regular to be natural. There, Mark pointed, near that bend in the river. Do you see it? Through the binoculars, I could make out what looked like structures built into the canyon walls. Not modern buildings, but something that suggested deliberate construction. Geometric shapes that contrasted with the organic curves of natural erosion. Could be ancient ruins, I said. There are lots of ancestral Puebloan sites in this area. But even as I said it, the structures looked wrong for any historical period I knew about. The angles were too sharp, the materials too reflective, and there was movement around them. Figures that seemed to be tending to some kind of machinery. We should hike down there, Mark said, his analytical curiosity overriding caution. Document whatever it is. Could be an important archaeological discovery. I was less enthusiastic about leaving our secure campsite to investigate unknown activity in the canyon depths, but Mark had already begun planning the expedition. He studied topographic maps, identified possible routes, calculated water requirements and hiking times with the thoroughness he brought to every project. It's about a 4-hour hike down and 6 back up, he said. If we start early, we can be there and back before dark. That afternoon, we descended into the canyon system via a route that wound between towering sandstone walls. The trail was ancient, probably carved by indigenous peoples centuries ago, but well-maintained despite its remoteness. As we hiked deeper, the walls rose higher around us, creating a sense of traveling backward through geological time. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, and the quality of light changed in ways that seemed to affect more than just vision. Colors appeared more saturated, shadows fell at impossible angles, and the rock formations seemed to shift and breathe when observed peripherally. Do you feel that? I asked as we paused to rest at a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon wall. Feel what? Like we're being watched, or studied. Mark looked around skeptically, but I could see him scanning the rocks above us with new awareness. The feeling was subtle but persistent. The sense that our progress was being monitored by something patient and intelligent. Probably just the isolation getting to us, he said. Big, empty spaces can create psychological effects. Makes us imagine things that aren't there. But as we continued hiking, the sensation grew stronger. Not threatening exactly, but intensely focused, as if we were subjects in some vast experiment whose parameters we couldn't understand. We reached the canyon floor as the sun passed directly overhead, though my watch insisted it was still early morning. The discrepancy between felt time and measured time had become impossible to ignore, suggesting something was fundamentally wrong with temporal flow in this place. The structures we'd spotted from above were more mysterious up close. They appeared to be built into natural caves and alcoves in the canyon walls, but the construction methods and materials were unlike anything from any historical period. Smooth surfaces that might have been metal or ceramic reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This isn't archaeological, Mark said, approaching one of the structures with scientific curiosity overriding caution. The construction techniques are too advanced, but it's not modern either. The materials, the integration with the rock formations, it's like nothing I've ever seen. Figures moved among the structures, human in shape but wrong in proportion and movement. They were tall and thin like the canyon shadows, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. When they noticed our approach, they didn't flee or hide, but simply observed us with the same patient attention I'd felt during our descent. We should document this, Mark said, reaching for his camera. But when he tried to photograph the structures, the images came out wrong, blurred and distorted as if the camera couldn't process what it was seeing. One of the figures approached us, moving with fluid grace that suggested familiarity with the canyon's treacherous terrain. Up close, it was obviously humanoid, but clearly not human. Its skin had the texture of weathered sandstone, and its eyes reflected light like polished minerals. You perceive the temporal fluctuations, it said in a voice that seemed to come from the canyon walls themselves. Most visitors cannot detect the adjustments we make to local chronodynamics. Mark's engineering background made him surprisingly adaptable to impossible situations. Instead of panicking, He began asking technical questions as if we'd encountered an advanced but comprehensible technology. "Temporal fluctuations," he said. "You're manipulating time somehow?" "We are the timekeepers," the entity replied, "guardians of continuity in this region. The geological processes here create natural temporal instabilities that require constant maintenance." It gestured toward the structures, which I now realized were some kind of monitoring and control equipment. Without our intervention, time flows inconsistently through this canyon system. Past and future leak into the present, creating paradoxes that could affect the entire timeline. "That's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke I was remembering the strange temporal sensations we'd experienced since arriving. "Your measurement devices have already detected the anomalies," the timekeeper said. "Your chronometers disagree because they are each measuring time flow at different rates. The canyon contains pockets where seconds last minutes and hours pass in moments." Mark was studying the alien technology with fascination rather than fear. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the canyon formed. We came here during the Miocene epoch to stabilize temporal fluctuations created by the geological upheaval. We have maintained our vigil for approximately 23 million years." The casual mention of such vast time frames made my head spin. These beings had been tending to time itself since before human ancestors had climbed down from trees, maintaining some kind of cosmic order that kept reality functioning properly. "What happens if you stop?" Mark asked. The timekeeper's expression, if it could be called that, grew more serious. "Temporal collapse. Past and future converge into an eternal present moment. All events that have occurred or will occur in this region happen simultaneously, creating a paradox that could propagate beyond the canyon and affect global timeline stability." I was beginning to understand why the locals had warned us about this area, not because it was dangerous in any conventional sense, but because it was the site of incomprehensibly vast custodial work that most minds couldn't process without fracturing. "We should go," I said, feeling the weight of knowledge I wasn't equipped to handle. "We're intruding on something way beyond our understanding." But Mark was already deep in conversation with the timekeeper, discussing temporal mechanics with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for particularly elegant code. His analytical mind had found a puzzle complex enough to fully engage his attention, and he was reluctant to walk away from the most significant discovery in human history. "They're offering to show us how it works," he said. "The temporal monitoring systems. Think about what we could learn." The timekeeper had been studying us during our conversation, and now it spoke with what might have been concern. "Your species operates on brief timescales that make temporal perception difficult. Exposure to our monitoring systems could cause permanent dissociation from normal time flow." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know. "You would experience all moments of your existence simultaneously. Birth, childhood, marriage, death, every instant of your timeline perceived as equally present and real. Most organic minds cannot maintain coherence under such conditions." Mark looked like he was considering the offer anyway, drawn by the possibility of understanding ultimate reality even at the cost of his sanity. His engineer's mind couldn't resist the chance to examine the fundamental mechanisms of existence. "Mark, no," I said, grabbing his arm. "Whatever they're offering, it's not worth losing yourself." But he was already walking toward one of the monitoring stations, his scientific curiosity overriding every survival instinct. The timekeeper made no move to stop him, but its posture suggested resignation rather than encouragement. "The choice must be voluntary," it said. "We cannot force temporal awareness on unwilling subjects, but we cannot prevent those who seek understanding from experiencing its consequences." Mark reached the monitoring station, a complex arrangement of crystalline structures that seemed to bend space around themselves. As his hand approached the central interface, I could see his expression changing, his face taking on the same mineral texture as the timekeeper's skin. "I can see it," he breathed. "All of it. Every moment I've ever lived. Every choice I've made. Every possible future branching out from this instant. It's beautiful." But even as he spoke, I could see him changing. His movements became stilted, mechanical, as if he was trying to coordinate actions across multiple timelines simultaneously. His eyes took on the same reflective quality as the timekeepers, suggesting he was perceiving realities beyond normal human comprehension. "Mark, come back," I called, but he was already lost in temporal perception that made linear existence seem like a narrow prison. He'd traded his human experience of time for cosmic awareness, but the cost was his ability to function as the person I'd married. "He will adapt," the timekeeper said, though its tone suggested uncertainty. "Some minds can integrate temporal omniscience. Others fragment under the pressure of experiencing all moments simultaneously. Ida, I watched my husband becoming something other than human, his consciousness expanding to encompass timescales that organic brains weren't designed to process. He was still Mark in some sense, but he was also every version of Mark that had ever existed or could exist, and the synthesis was too much for his individual identity to survive. "Can you change him back?" I asked. "Time flows only forward for biological entities," the timekeeper replied. "What he has experienced cannot be unexperienced. He now perceives reality as we do, all moments equally present, all possibilities equally real." Mark turned toward me with eyes that held the depth of geological time. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes of conversations from across our entire relationship, past and future bleeding together into incomprehensible meaning. "Jessica, I understand now. Why we fight, why we disconnect, why love feels so fragile. Because you're experiencing it in sequence, moment by moment, without seeing how it all fits together. But I can see our whole timeline, our marriage, our children, our deaths, all of it happening at once. It's perfect, but the Mark I'd married was gone, replaced by something that contained his memories and personality, but experienced existence in ways that made communication impossible. He'd achieved the cosmic perspective he'd always craved, but at the cost of being able to share it with anyone still trapped in linear time. I backed away from the monitoring station, overwhelmed by the realization that I'd lost my husband to a form of enlightenment that was indistinguishable from madness. The timekeeper watched with what might have been sympathy, though its alien features made emotional reading difficult. "This is why we warn biological entities away from our installations," it said. "Temporal awareness is evolutionary destiny for your species, but premature exposure causes integration failure. He has seen too much too quickly. How do I get him back? You cannot, but you can choose to join him. Experience time as he now does. Understand your relationship from outside its linear progression. The temptation was stronger than I'd expected. To see our marriage from a cosmic perspective. To understand how all our moments of love and conflict fit together into some greater pattern. To trade my limited human viewpoint for the vast comprehension that Mark now possessed. But I could see what that comprehension had cost him." Mark stood frozen beside the monitoring station, his awareness scattered across decades of experience that his mind was trying to process simultaneously. He'd gained ultimate understanding but lost the ability to live in any single moment. "I'm staying human," I said, backing toward the canyon trail. "I'm staying in linear time." The timekeeper made no move to stop me. "The choice is always individual. We neither encourage nor prevent temporal evolution. We simply maintain the systems that make choice possible," Mark called after me as I began the long climb back to the canyon rim, but his words came from every point in our relationship simultaneously. Declarations of love mixed with arguments, mixed with future conversations that hadn't happened yet. His voice carried the weight of our entire timeline, but it no longer belonged to the present moment. The hike back to Murphy Point felt like moving through thick fluid, as if the temporal distortions created by the timekeeper technology made normal movement difficult. My watch had stopped entirely, and the sun's position seemed unrelated to any reasonable passage of time. I reached our RV as what my body insisted was evening, though the sun suggested midday. Mark's absence filled the space like a presence, reminding me of every shared moment we'd experienced in our tiny rolling home. But now those moments felt fragmented, incomplete, experienced only in sequence instead of as part of the complete pattern he could now perceive. I packed our belongings mechanically, trying not to think about explaining Mark's disappearance to family and friends. How do you tell people that your husband achieved enlightenment by seeing all of time at once, but the experience destroyed his ability to exist in normal reality? The satellite phone worked sporadically, connecting me to rescue services for brief moments before cutting out. When I finally reached a park ranger, my explanation of Mark's disappearance made no sense. He's not lost, I tried to explain. He's become unstuck in time. He's experiencing our entire relationship simultaneously. They launched a search anyway, but I knew they wouldn't find Mark in any way they could recognize. He was still in the canyon with the timekeepers, learning to navigate existence from outside linear time. But the person who'd driven into the desert with me was gone, replaced by something that contained his memories but experienced them all at once. The drive back to Moab was surreal, every mile taking me further from the temporal anomalies but deeper into the impossibility of resuming normal life. How do you mourn someone who isn't dead but has evolved beyond human recognition? How do you continue living in sequential time when you've seen proof that it's an artificial limitation? I returned the RV and flew home to a life that felt incomplete in ways I couldn't explain to anyone. Mark's absence was both total and partial. He was gone from linear time, but somehow still present in the eternal moment he now inhabited. Sometimes I felt him trying to communicate across the temporal barriers, offering glimpses of our relationship's complete pattern. The strangest part is that I understand his choice. The limited perspective of sequential time really is a kind of prison, forcing us to experience love and loss and growth moment by moment, instead of as complete patterns. Mark had achieved the ultimate understanding of our relationship, seeing how every fight led to deeper connection, how every moment of distance created space for renewed intimacy. But that understanding came at the cost of being able to live any single moment fully. He'd traded the experience of time for knowledge about time, gaining cosmic perspective, but losing human presence. 6 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a collection of photographs I'd never seen, images of Mark and me throughout our relationship, but taken from impossible angles that suggested they'd been captured from outside normal space-time. In each photo, we looked exactly as we had in that moment, but the images somehow conveyed the entire emotional context of our relationship's progression. The final photograph showed me alone in our kitchen, reading the letter I was currently writing. But in the image, I was smiling with genuine peace, as if I'd finally understood something important about love and time and the choices we make in seeking connection with each other. I still don't know what Mark wanted me to understand through those photographs. Maybe that our love story makes sense only when viewed from outside its sequential progression. Maybe that the moments of disconnection and conflict were necessary parts of a larger pattern that led to deeper intimacy. Or maybe he was showing me that even cosmic perspective can't solve the fundamental loneliness of consciousness, that understanding all of time simultaneously is just another kind of isolation. I keep the photographs on my desk at school, and sometimes students ask about them. I tell them they were taken by my husband, who learned to see things from a different perspective. They never ask the right questions to get the full story. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring at clocks and wondering what it would be like to experience all moments at once. To see my entire life as a complete pattern instead of a series of sequential experiences. To join Mark in whatever transcendent state he achieved among the timekeepers. The temporal anomalies affect more than just Canyonlands. I've started noticing them everywhere. Moments that last too long, hours that pass too quickly, the feeling that past and future are bleeding into the present. Maybe the timekeepers' work is becoming less effective, or maybe my exposure to their technology made me sensitive to temporal fluctuations. Either way, I'm changing. Slowly, gradually, but inevitably. I can feel linear time loosening its hold on my consciousness, moments beginning to overlap and blend in ways that suggest I'm developing the same temporal awareness that claimed Mark. Maybe that was always going to happen. Maybe the choice wasn't whether to evolve beyond human time perception, but when and how to make the transition. Mark chose sudden transformation through direct contact with alien technology. I'm experiencing gradual change through proximity to temporal instability. In the end, perhaps we'll meet again in whatever state exists outside sequential time. Perhaps we'll finally understand our relationship from the cosmic perspective that makes all its moments equally present and real. Perhaps love itself is what draws consciousness toward temporal transcendence, the desire to experience all moments of connection simultaneously instead of losing them to the flow of linear time. I don't know if that's beautiful or terrible, but I never believed in the stories they told about Dead Horse Point until what happened to me out there. My name is Michael Torres, I'm 35 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. The bachelor party had been Kevin Sullivan's idea. As my best friend since college and my soon-to-be best man, he'd insisted on planning something memorable for my last weekend of freedom. But Kevin's definition of memorable usually involved expensive restaurants and craft breweries, not camping in the Utah desert. "Trust me on this one," he said, showing me photos of Dead Horse Point State Park on his phone. "My cousin went there last year and said it was life-changing. Sometimes you need to get away from civilization to really appreciate what you have." The group consisted of 6 of us: myself, Kevin, my brother Danny Torres, my college roommate Alex Chen, my coworker Ryan Walsh, and my future brother-in-law Jason Park. We'd rented a massive 40-foot Class A motorhome that could sleep 8 people in luxury, complete with satellite TV, full kitchen, and enough beer storage to float a small boat. "This is going to be epic," Danny said as we loaded our supplies at the rental facility in Salt Lake City. At 28, my younger brother still approached life with the enthusiasm of a teenager, convinced that any adventure shared with friends would automatically become legendary. I had mixed feelings about the trip. Part of me was excited about spending quality time with my closest friends before marriage changed the dynamics of our relationships. But another part dreaded 3 days of forced bonding and the inevitable pressure to prove I was still one of the guys, despite my impending transition to married life. Sarah, my fiancée, had been supportive but worried. "Just promise me you won't do anything stupid," she'd said as I packed. "I want you back in one piece for the wedding." I'd promised, though privately I wondered what could go wrong on a camping trip to a state park. Dead Horse Point was famous for its spectacular overlook of the Colorado River and its appearance in countless movies and commercials. It seemed like the safest possible location for a group of 30-something professionals to spend a weekend drinking beer and reminiscing about college. The drive from Salt Lake City took us through increasingly dramatic landscape. Red rock formations rose from high desert plateau, creating a geological showcase that looked more like Mars than Earth. As we climbed toward Dead Horse Point, the views opened up to reveal vast canyons and mesas that stretched to the horizon. "Jesus, look at that," Alex said, pointing toward the overlook as we pulled into the state park. "How is this place even real?" Dead Horse Point offered one of the most spectacular views in the American West, a narrow peninsula of rock jutting out over the Colorado River, which carved through red sandstone canyons 2,000 feet below. The overlook provided a panoramic vista that encompassed thousands of square miles of canyon country, layer upon layer of geological history painted in shades of red, orange, and gold. "Why is it called Dead Horse Point?" Ryan asked as we set up camp at one of the RV sites near the overlook. Kevin consulted the guidebook he'd brought. "Legend says cowboys used to drive wild horses onto this point, then blocked the escape route with brush and rocks. The horses couldn't get back out, so they died of thirst while looking down at the river they couldn't reach." The story cast a somber mood over our spectacular surroundings. I found myself studying the point's geography and realizing how perfect a trap it was. A narrow neck of land that widened into a dead-end peninsula with sheer cliffs on 3 sides. Anything driven onto the point would have no escape except past whatever blocked the entrance. "That's fucking dark," Danny said, though he was grinning with the morbid fascination that had characterized his personality since childhood. "Imagine being stuck up here, dying of thirst while staring at water you can't reach. Talk about psychological torture." We spent the afternoon exploring the overlook and taking photos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the place. The beauty was undeniable, but underneath it lay a sense of malevolent hunger that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. The point felt like a predator, beautiful, patient, and designed to lure prey into an inescapable trap. "Anyone else feeling weird about this place?" I asked as we prepared dinner on the RV's outdoor grill. "Weird how?" Kevin replied, though I noticed he kept glancing toward the overlook with nervous energy. "Like we're being watched, or evaluated." Alex laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's just the isolation. Big empty spaces mess with your head. Makes you imagine things that aren't there." But that night, as we sat around our campfire drinking beer and telling stories, I realized I wasn't imagining anything. The point was watching us, studying us with the patience of something that had perfected the art of waiting. The hunger started small. It began as simple appetite, nothing unusual for a group of guys camping and drinking. But by our second day, it had become something more urgent, more consuming. We found ourselves eating constantly, going through our food supplies at an alarming rate despite bringing enough provisions for a week. "I'm still starving," Ryan said after finishing his third breakfast burrito. "It's like I haven't eaten in days." Danny was already reaching for more bacon, his usual jokes about food replaced by single-minded focus on consumption. Alex had opened a bag of trail mix and was methodically eating handfuls while staring out at the canyon below. "Must be the altitude," Kevin suggested, though Dead Horse Point sat at only about 6,000 feet, not high enough to cause significant physiological effects. Or the dry air. Dehydration can feel like hunger. But we were drinking plenty of water, and the hunger wasn't satisfied by any amount of food. If anything, eating seemed to make it worse, as if our bodies were learning to crave sustenance with increasing desperation. By afternoon, we'd consumed nearly half our supplies despite planning for 3 full days. I suggested driving to Moab for more groceries, but the idea of leaving the point felt physically painful. The hunger was becoming location-specific, stronger when we were near the overlook and almost unbearable when we considered departing. "We should stay," Jason said, though he couldn't explain why. "There's something about this place. I feel like I need to be here." I felt it too, a compulsion to remain at Dead Horse Point that grew stronger as the hunger intensified. The combination was creating a feedback loop. The point made us hungry. The hunger made us want to stay. Staying made the hunger worse. That evening, as we grilled the last of our steaks, I noticed changes in my friends that went beyond simple appetite. Their eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, and their conversation revolved obsessively around food. Not just eating, but the sensation of consumption itself, the texture of meat, the satisfaction of swallowing, the way hunger felt both terrible and somehow essential. "You know what I miss?" Danny said, staring into the fire with unusual intensity. "The feeling of being really, truly hungry. Like when we were kids and Mom would make us wait for dinner. That edge, that anticipation. Food tastes better when you're desperate for it." Ryan nodded eagerly. "Everything's too easy now, too available. We've lost touch with what hunger really means." Their words made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. There was something worship-like in their tone, as if they were developing a philosophy around starvation that went beyond normal appreciation for food. The third day brought escalation. I woke to find Alex standing at the edge of our campsite, staring down at the canyon floor with binoculars. His body was rigid with concentration, and when I approached, I could hear him muttering under his breath. "There's something down there," he said without lowering the binoculars. "In the river. Something that doesn't belong." I took the binoculars and scanned the Colorado River 2,000 feet below. At first, I saw only water and rock, the natural curves of a desert river cutting through ancient stone. Then I caught it, shapes moving in the water that were too regular, too purposeful to be debris or wildlife. Bodies, dozens of them, floating in the current but somehow maintaining formation. They moved like a school of fish, turning and diving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence rather than death. "What the hell?" I adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer view. The bodies looked human, but wrong. Too pale, too elongated, as if they'd been stretched by their time in the water. Some appeared to be wearing clothes, others were naked, but all moved with the same fluid grace that dead things shouldn't possess. "They're not dead," Alex said, his voice carrying a strange longing. "They're waiting, calling." As if responding to his words, the bodies in the river began to surface, their faces turning upward toward our position on the point. Even from 2,000 feet away, I could feel their attention like a physical weight. They were looking at us with hungry anticipation, as if we were expected guests who were overdue for arrival. "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the overlook. "Right now." But when I turned toward our RV, I found the others standing in a line, all facing the canyon with the same expression of ravenous fascination. Kevin, Danny, Ryan, Jason. They'd arranged themselves along the cliff edge like offerings, their bodies swaying slightly as if responding to music only they could hear. "Don't you feel it?" Kevin asked without taking his eyes off the water below. "The calling. They're so hungry down there. They've been waiting so long for someone to join them." "Join them how?" I demanded, though I was afraid I already knew. Danny turned toward me with eyes that reflected the canyon's depths. "The same way the horses did. The beautiful way. Slow and perfect and forever." I realized then that Dead Horse Point hadn't just trapped wild horses in the past, it was still trapping them. My friends, me, anyone who stayed long enough to feel the hunger that emanated from this ancient predator disguised as scenic overlook. The point fed on desperation. It cultivated hunger until visitors became so consumed with need that death seemed preferable to continued wanting. The horses hadn't died of thirst while staring at unreachable water. They'd thrown themselves off the cliffs to join whatever waited in the river below. "Fight it," I said, grabbing Kevin's shoulder. "This isn't you. This isn't any of you. The place is doing something to our minds, making us want things that will kill us." But Kevin pulled away from my touch, his attention fixed on the canyon depths where the pale bodies continued their underwater dance. "You don't understand," he said. "The hunger isn't punishment. It's invitation. They're showing us what we could become if we stopped fighting and just let go." Alex had moved closer to the cliff edge, leaning forward as if preparing to dive. "Imagine never being hungry again," he said. "Never wanting anything because you've become part of something that consumes everything. Perfect satisfaction through perfect surrender." I looked at my friends, the people I'd known for years, who'd been groomsmen at each other's weddings, who'd supported each other through career changes and relationship dramas and all the ordinary challenges of adult life. The hunger was transforming them into something else, beings who worshipped starvation as a path to transcendence. "Sarah," I said, using the only weapon I had left. "My wedding, my life. I can't do this to her." For a moment, Kevin's expression flickered with recognition. The mention of my fiancée seemed to penetrate the hunger's hold, reminding him of connections that existed beyond this cursed point. But then his face hardened again, and he smiled with terrible compassion. "She'll understand," he said, "when the hunger takes her too. Everyone comes to Dead Horse Point eventually. Everyone learns what the horses learned." That's when I understood the full scope of the trap. Dead Horse Point didn't just kill visitors, it recruited them. The bodies in the river weren't victims but evangelists, spreading the hunger's influence to draw new prey to the point. My friends would become part of the hunting party, using their knowledge of human psychology to lure others into the same beautiful starvation they'd discovered. I ran for the RV, but the keys were gone. Kevin had them, and he was already walking toward the cliff edge with the measured pace of someone who'd found his purpose. The others followed in single file, their faces serene with the peace of absolute surrender. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Danny called back to me. "The hunger always wins. Fighting it just prolongs the suffering." I had one chance, the satellite phone in our emergency kit. But when I reached for it, my hands were shaking with a hunger so intense it made coherent thought difficult. The point was working on me too, using my friend's surrender to amplify my own desperation. The phone connected after several failed attempts, reaching a park ranger whose voice seemed to come from another world. Dead Horse Point State Park. This is Ranger Martinez. Emergency, I gasped. My friends, they're going to jump. Something's wrong with this place. It makes people want to... Sir, where are you located? The Overlook. All of them are walking toward the edge. They think there's something in the river calling to them. A long pause. Sir, I need you to step away from the Overlook immediately. Do not look down at the water. Do not listen to anything your friends tell you about hunger or joining anything. Can you get to a vehicle? They have the keys. Then run. Get as far from the point as possible. We're sending help, but you need to break the influence zone. As if the point could hear our conversation, the hunger suddenly intensified to unbearable levels. My stomach cramped with need so severe it felt like my organs were consuming themselves. The only relief came from looking toward the canyon, where my friends stood at the very edge of the cliff, their arms raised in welcome. Join us, Kevin called. It's time, Michael. Stop fighting and come home. The bodies in the river had surfaced completely now, floating in formation as they awaited our arrival. They were beautiful in their surrender, pale and perfect and free from every form of wanting except the eternal hunger that connected them to this place. I took a step toward the Overlook, then another. The hunger was overwhelming every other consideration, making the idea of continued existence without satisfaction seem unbearable. Better to end the wanting by joining something that had perfected the art of consumption. Michael. A new voice cut through the hunger's hold. Sarah, my fiancée, speaking from the satellite phone I'd dropped. Ranger Martinez had somehow connected her to our emergency call. Sarah. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Baby, whatever's happening, fight it. I need you to come home to me. Our wedding is in 2 weeks. Our life together. Remember what you're fighting for. Her voice was an anchor to everything the hunger wanted me to abandon. Love, future plans, the messy complications of human existence that made life worth living despite its inherent dissatisfactions. Sarah represented the choice to embrace wanting as part of being alive rather than seeking escape through surrender. I love you, I said, using the words like a weapon against the point's influence. I'm coming home. But even as I spoke, I could see my friends preparing to jump. They stood in a line at the cliff edge holding hands like children playing a game. The hunger had given them perfect peace by promising perfect satisfaction through perfect surrender. Don't watch, Sarah said, as if she could sense what was about to happen. Don't look at them. Just run. I turned away as Kevin led the others over the edge, their bodies disappearing into the canyon depths without screams or struggles. They went quietly, peacefully, embracing the fall as the final step in their conversion to something that no longer experienced hunger because it had become hunger itself. The satellite phone died as they hit the water, leaving me alone on Dead Horse Point with an appetite that felt like it was devouring me from within. But Sarah's voice had given me something to hold on to. The understanding that some forms of wanting were worth preserving because they connected us to life rather than death. I ran from the Overlook, fighting the compulsion to turn back and witness my friend's transformation into the pale guardians that swam in the river below. The hunger followed me for the first mile, then gradually weakened as I put distance between myself and the point's influence. Ranger Martinez found me collapsed on the access road, dehydrated and delirious but alive. The search and rescue team that went to recover my friends found only our abandoned RV and camping gear. The bodies that had gone into the river were never recovered, though subsequent visitors reported seeing figures swimming in the Colorado's depths. The official report listed my friends as victims of a mass suicide brought on by severe dehydration and heat-related psychosis. The Park Service installed additional safety barriers and warning signs at the Overlook, but they couldn't address the real danger. The hunger that still calls to visitors who stay too long and listen too carefully to what the point has to offer. I married Sarah 3 months later in a small ceremony that felt like an act of defiance against everything Dead Horse Point represented. Our vows were an affirmation that some forms of hunger, for love, for connection, for shared experience, were worth maintaining, even though they could never be permanently satisfied. But the hunger still visits me sometimes, especially when I'm alone or stressed or feeling disconnected from the life I chose over surrender. It whispers about the peace my friends found, the perfect satisfaction that waits for anyone willing to join the pale congregation that swims in ancient waters. I've learned to recognize these moments as echoes of my time at Dead Horse Point, remnants of an influence that almost claimed me. When the hunger comes, I call Sarah, or visit friends, or engage in activities that remind me why being alive, with all its wants and needs and unfulfilled desires, is preferable to the alternative. Because I understand now what the horses really experienced on that point. Not death by thirst, but seduction by the promise of never being thirsty again. The hunger offers escape from every form of wanting through dissolution into something that exists only to consume. It's a beautiful trap, perfectly designed to appeal to anyone who's ever felt overwhelmed by the appetites and ambitions that define human existence. And it's still there, waiting patiently for the next group of friends who think they can handle a few days of camping at one of Utah's most scenic overlooks. The stories warn you about Dead Horse Point, but they never tell you the whole truth. They never mention that the horses chose to die there, and they never explain how beautiful that choice can seem when you're hungry enough to believe that wanting is worse than being wanted by something vast and patient and forever unsatisfied. Don't go to Dead Horse Point. Not unless you're prepared to discover how much you're willing to surrender for the promise of never wanting anything again. We should have never gone to Escalante. I'm Daniel Rodriguez. I was 31 back then. And this is the story of how I lost everything. The work retreat had been Maya's idea. As the new creative director at Pinnacle Marketing, she wanted to take her team somewhere inspiring for their quarterly planning session. Somewhere without distractions, she'd said during our morning coffee. No Wi-Fi, no cell towers, no excuses not to think outside the box. Maya had always been ambitious, driven by a need to prove herself in an industry that rarely gave women of color the recognition they deserved. At 28, she was the youngest creative director in the agency's history, and she carried that weight like armor. Beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying when focused on a goal. Utah's perfect, she continued, showing me photos on her laptop of red rock formations and endless sky. There's this place called Escalante. Completely remote, but there are RV rental companies that'll deliver to campsites. We can have our meetings during the day and decompress at night. I supported the idea, though privately I worried about Maya's stress levels. The promotion had come with impossible expectations, and a team of creative professionals who resented taking direction from someone younger than themselves. She'd been working 16-hour days for months, fueled by anxiety and determination in equal measure. The team consisted of Maya, myself as the account manager, and 4 other creatives. Josh Park, a photographer in his mid-30s who'd been passed over for Maya's promotion. Kristen Webb, a copywriter with 20 years of experience and a barely concealed disdain for anyone under 40. David Chen, a graphic designer fresh out of art school who worshipped Maya from afar. And Angela Santos, a project manager who seemed to thrive on workplace drama. We rented 2 large RVs from a company in Salt Lake City, a 36-foot Winnebago for Maya, David, and Angela, and a similar model for Josh, Kristen, and myself. The plan was to caravan to a dispersed camping area near Escalante, Utah, where we'd have complete isolation for 5 days of intensive creative work. The drive from Salt Lake took us through increasingly alien landscape. Desert valleys gave way to slick rock formations that looked like frozen waves of stone. Red, orange, and white layers of sediment created a geological history book written in color and texture. It was beautiful and unsettling, like driving across the surface of an abandoned planet. Jesus, it's like Mars out here, Josh muttered from the passenger seat, filming everything with his professional camera rig. Are we sure there's actually a campsite where we're going? I checked the GPS coordinates Maya had provided. We were heading for a dispersed camping area in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, accessed by a dirt road that wound through 20 miles of slot canyons and mesas. The rental company had assured us their RVs could handle the terrain, but as the pavement ended and we began bouncing over rutted earth, I had my doubts. Kristen sat at the dinette table, her laptop open despite the constant jostling. "This is insane," she said, not for the first time. We could be doing this work in a conference room like normal people. But when we finally reached our destination, even Kristen fell silent. The campsite sat in a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering sandstone walls. Red rock formations rose on all sides, creating perfect isolation while opening to a sky so vast and clear it seemed unreal. A seasonal stream had carved the clearing over millennia, leaving behind smooth stone platforms and natural pools that reflected the canyon walls like mirrors. "It's perfect," Maya said over the radio as we parked our RVs side by side. Completely cut off from the world, no choice but to focus. We spent the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The canyon walls were covered in a dark patina called desert varnish, creating natural blackboards that reflected sound in strange ways. Every word echoed multiple times, creating overlapping conversations that made it difficult to follow discussions. "The acoustics are incredible," David said, positioning himself in the center of the clearing and clapping his hands. The sound bounced off the walls in a complex rhythm, returning from different directions with varying delays. "It's like a natural recording studio." Angela was less impressed. "It's creepy. Everything we say gets repeated back at us. It's like the rocks are eavesdropping." That first evening, we gathered around a campfire between the two RVs and tried to conduct our first planning session. But the echoes made it nearly impossible to have a coherent conversation. Words overlapped and interfered with each other, creating a cacophony that left us all speaking in whispers. "Maybe we should use one of the RVs for meetings," Maya suggested. "The acoustics will be better indoors, but even inside, something felt wrong." The RV's windows reflected the canyon walls so perfectly they seemed like portals to other versions of our campsite. Sometimes I caught movement in the glass that didn't match our activities. Figures walking past windows when everyone was accounted for, shadows that fell in the wrong directions. "Daniel, are you paying attention?" Maya's sharp voice cut through my distraction. I'd been staring at the window behind her where I could swear I'd seen someone watching us from outside. "Sorry, the reflections are just disorienting." Josh followed my gaze and frowned. "Yeah, there's something weird about the light here. Everything's too bright, too sharp. My camera's having trouble with the exposure." We tried to focus on work, but the environment seemed designed to fracture concentration. The echoes outside, the impossible reflections in the windows, the way shadows moved independently of their sources, it all contributed to a sense of unreality that made logical thinking difficult. By the second day, we were all on edge. Maya had become increasingly agitated, frustrated by our lack of progress and the team's obvious discomfort. She'd always been a perfectionist, but the stress of the new position had amplified her need for control to an almost pathological degree. "We're here to work," she snapped when Angela complained about the strange acoustics for the third time. "I don't care if the rocks are singing opera. We have deadlines to meet." But even Maya seemed affected by our surroundings. She kept checking her reflection in windows and mirrors, adjusting her hair and makeup obsessively. During breaks, I caught her having animated conversations with herself in the RV's bathroom mirror, practicing presentations for an audience that only she could see. Josh spent most of his time outside, photographing the canyon walls with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His usual professional detachment had been replaced by something more desperate, as if he was trying to capture something that kept eluding his lens. "There's something in the reflections," he told me privately as we cleaned up after lunch. "In the natural pools, the polished rock surfaces, even puddles from yesterday's rain. They show things that aren't there." "What kind of things?" "People. Always people, but not us. They're wearing different clothes, standing in different positions. Sometimes they're doing things we did hours ago, like the reflections are delayed. Sometimes they're doing things we haven't done yet." I wanted to dismiss it as artistic imagination, but I'd been seeing similar anomalies. The canyon seemed to be reflecting not just light, but time itself, showing us glimpses of past and future versions of our group. David had become fascinated by the desert varnish on the canyon walls. He spent hours studying the dark patina, convinced it contained patterns and images that could inspire his design work. But when he tried to photograph or sketch what he saw, The results never matched his descriptions. "It's like they're moving," he said, showing me his sketchbook filled with increasingly abstract drawings. "The patterns shift when I'm not looking directly at them. And sometimes I think they're trying to communicate." Kristen had retreated into herself, speaking only when directly addressed and avoiding eye contact with the rest of the group. She kept her laptop open constantly, typing furiously on documents that seemed to write themselves. When I glimpsed her screen, I saw dense paragraphs of text that didn't make sense, fragments of conversations that hadn't happened, meeting notes for sessions we hadn't conducted. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked her on the third morning. She looked up from her laptop with eyes that seemed too bright, too focused. "I'm productive for the first time in months. The echoes help me think. They repeat my ideas back to me so I can refine them, improve them. It's like having a collaborative partner that actually understands my work." But the echoes weren't just repeating her words anymore. They were anticipating them, speaking phrases a split second before she did. Sometimes they offered suggestions in her own voice, ideas she swore she hadn't thought of yet. By the fourth day, our group dynamic had completely fractured. Maya had become convinced that Josh was sabotaging the retreat out of resentment over her promotion. She spent hours reviewing his photographs, looking for evidence of deliberate incompetence or insubordination. "Look at this," she said, showing me Josh's camera display. The images showed our group engaged in various activities, but everyone's face was wrong, twisted into expressions of anger, fear, or malice that I didn't remember seeing. "He's deliberately making us look bad. He's planning to use these photos to undermine me with the partners." But when I looked at the same images an hour later, they appeared completely normal. Standard vacation shots of colleagues enjoying outdoor activities. Josh, meanwhile, had become paranoid about Maya's behavior. He was convinced she was using the retreat to build a case for firing him, documenting his every mistake for HR review. "She's recording everything," he whispered to me as we prepared dinner. "Listen to how she talks. Every conversation is an interrogation. She's trying to get me to say something she can use against me." I tried to mediate, but I was having my own problems with perception and reality. The mirrors in our RV showed reflections that moved independently of my actions. When I brushed my teeth, my reflection continued the motion after I'd stopped. When I turned away from the mirror, my reflection kept watching, following my movements with eyes that seemed more aware than they should be. Sleep became impossible. The echoes continued throughout the night, carrying fragments of conversations from previous days. Sometimes they predicted arguments that would happen the next morning, word for word. Other times they replayed confrontations from my childhood, my reflection's voice perfectly mimicking family members who'd been dead for years. "We need to leave," I told Maya on the morning of the fifth day. "Everyone's losing it. This place is affecting our perception, our judgment. We can finish the planning sessions back in the office." But Maya refused to consider cutting the retreat short. Her behavior had become increasingly erratic, her perfectionism evolving into something that bordered on megalomania. "We're staying until we complete our objectives," she said, her voice carrying an echo even though we were inside the RV. "I won't let this team fail because they're afraid of a little discomfort." When I looked at her closely, I realized her reflection in the window behind her was shaking its head, disagreeing with everything she said. The reflection's mouth moved in silent words of protest while Maya herself continued her aggressive demands for productivity. That afternoon, things fell apart completely. David had been working on a series of designs inspired by the canyon walls, but when he showed them to Maya, she became furious. The images were abstract representations of human figures, but something about them was deeply disturbing. The proportions were wrong, the anatomy twisted in ways that suggested pain or transformation. "This is garbage," Maya said, though her reflection in David's laptop screen seemed to be studying the images with fascination. "Are you trying to destroy our client relationships? These look like something from a horror movie." David's face crumpled. He'd been working for 16 hours straight, convinced he was creating his masterpiece. "You don't understand the vision. The canyon showed me these forms. their evolution, transformation, becoming something better than human. "You're having a breakdown," Maya snapped, just like Josh with his paranoid photographs and Kristen with her automatic writing. "This place is making everyone insane." But as she spoke, I noticed her reflection was mimicking David's expressions. The hurt, the creative passion, the desperate need for validation. Whatever was affecting our perception was affecting Maya too, even if she couldn't see it. The final crisis came that evening when Angela claimed she'd seen duplicates of all of us. "There are other versions of our group," she said, her voice shaking with conviction. "I saw them in the reflecting pools. They're having the same retreat we are, but they're different people. More successful, more confident. They're showing us what we could become if we weren't so afraid." She led us to a natural pool formed by centuries of erosion in the canyon floor. The water was so still it created a perfect mirror, reflecting the sky and canyon walls above. But as we gathered around it, the reflection showed something impossible. There we were, Maya, Josh, Kristen, David, Angela, and myself. But we looked different. Older, more accomplished, radiating the kind of confidence that comes with genuine success. The reflected Maya stood straighter, spoke with authority that didn't seem forced. The reflected Josh smiled with genuine warmth instead of defensive sarcasm. The reflected Kristen engaged with ideas instead of dismissing them. "That's not us," Maya whispered, but she couldn't look away from her reflection's composed leadership. That's who we could be." The reflected group was having the same conversation we were, but their words were different. They spoke with respect for each other, built on ideas instead of tearing them down, collaborated instead of competing. Their retreat was accomplishing everything ours had failed to achieve. "We have to go down there," David said, stepping closer to the pool. "We have to join them. They know the secret to being better than we are." Josh was filming frantically, but his camera showed only our actual reflections. Flawed, stressed, dysfunctional versions of ourselves. "It's not real," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's some kind of optical illusion. The water, the minerals, the light angles." But even as he spoke, I could see him comparing himself to his reflection's easy confidence. "What if it's not an illusion?" Kristen asked. She'd been silent for most of the day, but now she seemed more lucid than she'd been since we arrived. "What if there really are better versions of ourselves somewhere else? What if this place is showing us alternate possibilities?" Maya knelt beside the pool, staring at her reflection with hungry intensity. She looked so capable, like she knows exactly what she's doing, like the team actually respects her instead of just tolerating her. The reflected Maya was indeed impressive, leading with quiet authority, inspiring rather than demanding, secure in her abilities without needing to prove them constantly. Everything our Maya aspired to be, but couldn't quite achieve. "Maybe we can trade places," Angela suggested. "Step through somehow. Become the better versions of ourselves." It sounded insane, but after 5 days of fractured reality, insane was starting to feel logical. We were all failures in our own ways. Maya's insecurity masquerading as aggression, Josh's resentment poisoning his creativity, Kristen's cynicism blocking her potential, David's inexperience making him desperate for validation, Angela's need for drama creating conflict, and my own passivity allowing it all to continue. The reflections offered escape from our limitations. One by one, we reached toward the water. Maya went first, extending her hand toward her reflection's confident face. The surface tension broke with barely a ripple, and for a moment her hand seemed to pass through into another space entirely. Her reflection smiled and reached back, their fingers almost touching. Then something went wrong. Maya screamed and jerked her hand back, but it came up wrong. Aged, weathered, scarred by experiences she'd never had. The fingernails were longer, the skin rougher. The wedding ring she'd never worn gleaming on a finger that belonged to someone else's life. "It's not me," she gasped, staring at the alien hand attached to her familiar arm. "It's someone else. Someone who lived differently, chose differently. I can feel her memories trying to replace mine." But even as she spoke, parts of her were changing. Her voice grew more confident, Her posture straightened. Her eyes took on the focused intensity of someone who'd never doubted their capabilities. The reflection's qualities were bleeding through, transforming Maya into someone she'd never been. Josh stepped back from the pool in horror, but his reflection remained, beckoning him to complete the exchange. In the water, his other self was everything he'd dreamed of becoming: respected, successful, creatively fulfilled. But Maya's transformation showed the price of such improvement. "We have to get away from here," I said, but my own reflection was smiling with a warmth I'd never possessed, offering the emotional connection I'd always struggled to create. "Now, before we all become who we were meant to be?" Maya's voice had changed completely, carrying the authority of someone who'd never struggled with self-doubt. Why would we run from evolution? She was right, in a way. The reflected versions were improvements, upgrades, better iterations of our fundamental selves. But they were also strangers wearing our faces, people who'd lived different lives and made different choices. Trading places meant erasing who we were for who we might have been. Kristen was the next to reach for the water, drawn by her reflection's obvious engagement and enthusiasm. But when her fingers touched the surface, her reflection grabbed back with desperate hunger, trying to pull her through entirely. "She's drowning," Kristen gasped as her reflection's memories flooded her consciousness. "She's trapped in there, surrounded by all the versions of herself she never became. They're all trying to escape, to trade places with us. The pool wasn't showing us better versions of ourselves. It was showing us the accumulated regrets and lost possibilities of everyone who'd ever looked into its perfect surface. Thousands of reflected lives, trapped and desperate to experience physical existence again." David pulled Kristen away from the water, but the damage was done. She was already changing, her cynicism replaced by the eager curiosity of someone who'd chosen different paths, embraced different opportunities. Part of her had traded places with a reflection that had never learned to protect itself with emotional walls. "We're all changing," Angela whispered, and she was right. Just being near the pool was enough to trigger the transformation. Our reflections were learning from us while we absorbed their alternative experiences. The boundary between who we were and who we might have been was dissolving. Maya was almost unrecognizable now. Confident, charismatic, successful in ways that came from deep conviction rather than desperate ambition. She moved with the grace of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. "This is beautiful," she said, her new voice carrying absolute certainty. "We're becoming our best selves. Why fight it?" But I could see the original Maya trapped behind her reflection's eyes, screaming silently as her personality was overwritten by someone else's achievements. The transformation wasn't improvement. It was possession by alternative selves who'd lived the lives we'd only dreamed of. Josh and I grabbed David and ran for the RVs, leaving Kristen and Angela to be consumed by their reflection's urgent desires for physical form. Behind us, Maya called out with her borrowed voice, trying to convince us to return and complete our transformations. "You're running from happiness," she shouted, though her original self pounded against the prison of her reflected consciousness. "From success, from everything you've ever wanted." We reached the RVs and started the engines, desperate to escape the canyon before we lost ourselves entirely. But the mirrors inside the vehicles showed our alternative selves giving chase, running alongside the windows with expressions of desperate hunger. "Don't look at them," I told Josh as we navigated the rough dirt road out of the canyon. "Don't make eye contact. They're trying to complete the exchange." But Josh was already changing. His hands on the steering wheel were steadier, more confident. His usually sarcastic commentary had been replaced by thoughtful observations about light and composition. The reflection's creativity was overwhelming his defensive cynicism. "Maybe they're right," he said, his voice carrying unfamiliar warmth. "Maybe this is exactly what we needed, to become who we were supposed to be instead of who we ended up as." I grabbed the wheel as Josh's transformation accelerated, his original personality dissolving under the weight of his reflection's accomplished confidence. We made it out of the canyon, but barely. Josh's new self was more interested in returning to help the others than in escaping whatever force was rewriting our identities. The drive back to Salt Lake City was a nightmare of fighting against my own reflection's attempts to take control. Every mirror, every window, every polished surface showed me the version of myself I'd always wanted to become. Emotionally available, professionally successful, romantically fulfilled. But I could see Daniel Rodriguez fading behind that improved reflection's eyes, my actual life being overwritten by someone else's better choices. I returned the RVs alone. Josh had disappeared somewhere near Moab, last seen walking toward a photographer's studio with the confident stride of someone who'd never struggled with self-doubt. His transformation was complete. He'd become his reflection, but his reflection had become him. An even trade that left no trace of the insecure, resentful man I'd known for 3 years. The rental company asked about the others, but what could I tell them? That my colleagues had traded themselves for better versions, becoming the people they'd always dreamed of being at the cost of ceasing to be themselves. That they were probably still in that canyon, helping their reflections lure other travelers into making the same exchange. Maya's final social media posts showed someone living her perfect life. Confident leadership, successful campaigns, the respect and admiration she'd always craved. But it wasn't Maya posting them. It was her reflection, wearing her face and living in her apartment, doing everything Maya had dreamed of with the personality of someone who'd never needed to dream it. The police investigation found no trace of foul play. 5 adults had simply vanished during a corporate retreat, leaving behind successful versions of themselves that no one questioned. Maya's reflection continued working at the agency, impressing clients and managing teams with natural authority. Josh's reflection was building a photography business that was already attracting national attention. Only I knew the truth, that my friends had been replaced by their own unrealized potential, trapped in a canyon that collected reflected lives and offered them physical form in exchange for the original's consciousness. I fought the transformation for weeks after returning home, covering every mirror in my apartment and avoiding reflective surfaces. But it was impossible to escape entirely. Store windows, car mirrors, puddles after rain, every reflection showed me the Daniel I could have become, begging to trade places with the Daniel I actually was. The worst part was that he was better than me in every way. More confident, more successful, more emotionally intelligent. He'd made different choices, taken risks I'd avoided, built the life I'd always wanted but never pursued. Slowly, inevitably, I began to weaken. What was the point of protecting a life I wasn't fully satisfied with when a better version was waiting in every reflective surface? Why cling to my actual experiences when my reflection offered improved alternatives? The transformation happened gradually, imperceptibly. I started making decisions my reflection would make, speaking with confidence I'd never possessed, approaching challenges with optimism that felt foreign but comfortable. People noticed the change. Friends, family, co-workers all commented on my improved outlook and increased self-assurance. But I knew the truth. I was becoming my reflection, while my reflection became me. An exchange so gradual that no one noticed when the real Daniel Rodriguez finally disappeared entirely. I'm writing this as the last remnant of my original consciousness, the final spark of who I used to be before my reflection completes its transformation into me. Tomorrow, I'll wake up as the improved version of myself, and this Daniel will exist only as a reflection trapped in mirrors, desperate to trade places with other unsatisfied travelers. Don't go to Escalante. Don't look too long into the reflecting pools or polished canyon walls. And if you see better versions of yourself beckoning from any mirror or window or still water, remember that becoming who you could have been means ceasing to be who you actually are. The reflection, typing these words, is almost indistinguishable from the original now. Soon, there will be no difference at all. Soon, I'll be exactly who I always wanted to be. Soon, I'll stop being me entirely. The canyon is always accepting new visitors, always showing them reflected possibilities too tempting to resist. Maya and Josh and the others are probably still there, helping their replacements lure fresh groups into trading their authentic lives for improved alternatives. Maybe you'll meet them if you go to Escalante. Maybe they'll convince you that becoming your reflection is the best decision you could make. Maybe they'll be right. After all, who wouldn't want to be a better version of themselves? Who wouldn't trade their actual life for their perfect one? Just remember to ask what happens to the original when the reflection takes over. Just remember to wonder where the real person goes. Just remember that some improvements come at a price too terrible to pay. But you won't remember, will you? The reflections are very persuasive, and they've had so much practice. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Bear Lake. I'm Rebecca Walsh, and I was 27 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The camping trip was supposed to be a celebration. My sister Emma had finally finished her residency at Johns Hopkins and wanted to decompress somewhere far from hospitals and city stress. She'd always been the responsible one, 4 years older than me, perpetually worried about everyone else's well-being. This trip was my chance to take care of her for once. I found the perfect spot, I told her over FaceTime, holding up my laptop screen to show the rental listing. Private RV site right on Bear Lake, northern Utah. Completely isolated, no cell service, just us and nature. Emma's exhausted face brightened slightly. That actually sounds amazing. When's the last time we did something like this? Just the two of us. Not since before med school, we realized. Nearly 8 years of cramming our sisterhood into brief holiday visits and hurried phone calls. This 3-week trip would give us time to reconnect, to remember who we were beyond career pressures and adult responsibilities. The RV rental company in Salt Lake City provided a 28-foot Winnebago that smelled faintly of pine air fresheners and previous adventures. Emma handled the driving while I navigated, our route taking us through increasingly mountainous terrain as we headed toward the Utah-Idaho border. Bear Lake stretched before us like a slice of the Caribbean dropped into the Rocky Mountains. The water was an impossible shade of turquoise, so vivid it looked artificial against the backdrop of forested hills and snow-capped peaks. Our rental site sat on the lake's remote eastern shore, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of aspen and pine. Jesus, we really are in the middle of nowhere, Emma said as we pulled into the clearing that would be our home for the next 3 weeks. The site included a concrete pad for the RV, a picnic table, fire ring, and a small dock extending into the crystal-clear water. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 5 miles away, the nearest town 15. Perfect, I said, though something about the isolation felt more ominous than peaceful. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, and the fourth opened onto water so still it looked like polished glass. No waves, no ripples, no sign of fish or waterfowl. Just that unnatural turquoise surface reflecting the late afternoon sky. We spent the first day settling in and exploring the immediate area. A hiking trail marked with faded blazes led from our campsite into the forest, supposedly connecting to a network of paths that crisscrossed the surrounding mountains. Emma was eager to start hiking immediately, but years of medical training had made her methodical about preparation. "We need to map out the trails first," she said, spreading a topographic map across the picnic table. "Identify landmarks, plan our routes, establish check-in procedures." I laughed. We're not performing surgery. It's just hiking." But she insisted on treating it like a medical mission, complete with detailed supply lists and emergency protocols. Part of me found her caution endearing, but another part worried that she'd forgotten how to simply experience things without analyzing them to death. That first night, we grilled salmon on the camp stove and watched the sun set over Bear Lake's impossible water. The silence was profound. No traffic, no neighbors, no electronic hum. Just the occasional crack of settling wood in the fire and the gentle lap of water against the dock. "This is exactly what I needed," Emma said, leaning back in her camp chair with a glass of wine. I can't remember the last time I wasn't thinking about patients or procedures or medical journals. I was about to respond when movement caught my eye. Something pale shifting between the trees about 50 yards from our campsite. I strained to make it out in the gathering darkness, but whatever it was had vanished. "Did you see that?" I asked. Emma followed my gaze toward the forest. "See what?" There was someone walking between the trees. Wearing white, maybe? We sat quietly for several minutes, listening and watching, but the forest remained still. No footsteps, no breaking branches, no further glimpses of movement. "Probably just a trick of the light," Emma said, though she seemed less relaxed than before. "Shadows and firelight can create all kinds of illusions." But as we prepared for bed, I caught her checking the RV's locks twice and closing all the window blinds. I woke sometime after midnight to find Emma's bed empty. The RV's back bedroom was small, with twin beds separated by a narrow aisle. Emma's blankets were thrown back as if she'd gotten up suddenly, but she was nowhere to be seen. I checked the bathroom, the main living area, even looked outside through the windows. Our campsite lay empty in the moonlight. "Emma," I called softly, not wanting to wake any wildlife but needing to locate my sister. No response. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the night air sharp with mountain cold. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the lake stretched before me like a dark mirror. No sign of Emma anywhere. "Emma!" I called louder, my voice echoing off the water and disappearing into the forest. The silence that followed felt hostile, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I was about to start searching the hiking trail when I heard it. Footsteps on the dock. Slow, measured, deliberate. I turned toward the sound and felt my heart stop. Emma was walking down the dock toward the water, but something was wrong with her movement. Her steps were too regular, too mechanical, like a wind-up toy following its programming. She wore only her pajamas despite the cold, and her arms hung straight at her sides. "Emma!" I ran toward the dock, but she didn't respond. She reached the end and stood there for a moment, staring out at the dark water. Then, without hesitation, she stepped off the edge. The splash echoed across the lake as I dove in after her. The water was shockingly cold, so frigid it drove the breath from my lungs and made my muscles seize. I surfaced, gasping, and looked around frantically for Emma. She was floating about 10 feet away, face down and motionless. I swam to her as fast as my numbing limbs would allow and managed to grab her arm. She was completely limp, unresponsive, but still breathing. Getting her back to shore was a nightmare of cold water and dead weight. By the time I dragged her onto the beach, we were both hypothermic and shaking uncontrollably. I wrapped us both in blankets from the RV and built up the fire, holding Emma close until her body temperature stabilized. She woke confused and disoriented, with no memory of leaving the RV or walking into the lake. "I was dreaming," she said, her voice slurred with exhaustion. "There were people walking through the forest. They were calling to me, inviting me to join them." "What people?" "I don't know. They were all wearing white, walking in a line through the trees. They looked so peaceful, so purposeful, like they knew exactly where they were going." She shivered despite the blankets. "The last thing I remember was following them toward the water." I made her drink hot tea and checked her pupils, pulse, and breathing. Everything seemed normal, but sleepwalking wasn't normal for Emma. She'd never done it before, not even as a child. "Stress response," she said when I voiced my concern. "Sometimes extreme exhaustion can trigger unusual sleep behaviors. I've been running on maybe 4 hours a night for the past year." It sounded reasonable, medical, something we could understand and manage. But as dawn broke over Bear Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had actively called my sister into that dark water. The second day passed without incident. Emma seemed fully recovered from her midnight swim, and we spent the afternoon hiking one of the mapped trails that led to a scenic overlook. The forest was beautiful, but strangely quiet. No birdsong, no rustling small animals, no insect buzz. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the crunch of our boots on the trail. "It's so still here," Emma observed as we rested at the overlook. "Like a nature preserve, where all the wildlife has been relocated." Below us, Bear Lake stretched to the horizon, its turquoise water looking even more artificial from this height. I could make out our RV as a tiny white speck on the distant shore, and beyond it, the dark line of forest that pressed close to the water's edge. "There," Emma said suddenly, pointing toward our campsite. "Do you see them?" I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Tiny, white figures were moving through the trees near our camp. too distant to make out details, but clearly human forms walking in single file between the pines. "Who are they?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Emma was already reaching for her binoculars. She adjusted the focus and went very still. "They're all wearing the same thing. White robes or gowns, and they're all walking in exactly the same way. Same pace, same arm movement, like they're synchronized." She handed me the binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see them clearly. At least a dozen figures in flowing white garments, moving through the forest with identical mechanical steps. Their faces were hidden by hoods, and they seemed to glide rather than walk, flowing between the trees like a ghostly procession. "We need to get back," I said, but Emma was transfixed. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "So coordinated, so harmonious, like they're part of something larger than themselves." Her voice had taken on the same dreamy quality I'd heard the night before, just before she'd sleepwalked into the lake. I grabbed her shoulder and shook gently. "Em, we need to go. Now." She blinked and seemed to return to herself. "Right, yes, let's go." But as we hiked back toward camp, I caught her glancing repeatedly over her shoulder, as if the white figures were calling to her even from this distance. We reached our campsite as the sun was setting. The forest looked normal. No sign of the robed figures we'd observed from the overlook. But I felt watched, as if dozens of hidden eyes were tracking our movements from the shadows between the trees. Emma seemed agitated as evening fell. She paced around the campsite, checking and rechecking our supplies, adjusting and readjusting the camp chairs. When I suggested we turn in early, she shook her head. "I'm not tired. Not at all. Maybe I should take a walk, clear my head." "Absolutely not." The firmness in my voice surprised us both. "After last night, you're not going anywhere alone." She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, almost resentful. "You can't keep me here, Becca. I'm an adult. I can make my own decisions. Not when those decisions involve walking into a freezing lake in your pajamas." We argued for another hour, Emma growing increasingly agitated while I became more determined to keep her close. Finally, exhaustion won, and she agreed to try sleeping. But I noticed she left her hiking boots beside the bed instead of putting them away, and her jacket hung ready on the bedroom door. I lay awake, listening to her breathing, waiting for the moment she would inevitably rise and walk outside to join whatever was calling to her from the forest. It happened around 2 a.m. Emma's breathing changed from deep and regular to shallow and controlled. I heard the soft rustle of blankets, then the careful creak of floorboards as she tried to move silently through the RV. I gave her a 30-second head start, then followed. She was already outside, standing beside the cold fire ring with her back to me. In the moonlight, I could see she'd dressed in her hiking clothes, though I hadn't heard her putting them on. She stood perfectly still for several minutes, then began walking toward the forest. But she wasn't alone. White figures emerged from between the trees, the same robed procession we'd seen from the overlook. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching Emma's as she approached them. As my sister reached the edge of the forest, she fell into line behind the last figure, her movements becoming as mechanical and purposeful as theirs. I followed at a distance, using my phone's flashlight sparingly to avoid losing the trail. The procession moved through the forest with supernatural confidence, never hesitating at forks in the path, never stumbling over roots or rocks. They seemed to know these woods intimately, or perhaps the woods themselves were guiding their steps. The trail led steadily upward, away from the lake and deeper into the mountains. After what felt like hours of climbing, we emerged into a large clearing I didn't remember from any of the maps. In the center stood a structure that definitely wasn't on any official documentation. A wooden platform perhaps 50 feet across, raised about 6 feet off the ground, and surrounded by carved posts that looked far older than any European settlement in the area. The white figures arranged themselves in concentric circles on the platform, with Emma taking a position in the outer ring. In the moonlight, I could finally see their faces beneath the hoods. They were people, or had been once, men and women of various ages, all with the same vacant, peaceful expression. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and their eyes reflected light like polished stones. They stood perfectly motionless, waiting for something. Then the humming began. It started low, barely audible, rising from the throats of the assembled figures. Not quite music, not quite chanting, but something that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The sound grew stronger as more voices joined in, creating harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Emma added her voice to the chorus, though she'd never shown any musical ability before. Her humming blended perfectly with the others, as if she'd been practicing this unknown song her entire life. Her face had taken on the same peaceful vacancy as the robed figures, and her eyes reflected the moonlight with that same glassy shine. I crept closer, staying hidden in the tree line. The humming was beautiful and terrible, creating a longing so intense it was physically painful. Part of me wanted to step onto the platform and add my voice to theirs, to experience whatever transcendent state they'd achieved. But another part of me, the part that still remembered who Emma used to be, fought against the compulsion. The humming reached a crescendo, and then something began to happen to the figures on the platform. Their forms started to blur at the edges, becoming less solid, more translucent. The white robes fluttered in a wind I couldn't feel, and faces became harder to distinguish in the shifting light. Emma was changing too. Her solid form grew wavery, insubstantial, as if she was slowly dissolving into the collective consciousness that hummed and swayed on the ancient platform. Soon I realized there would be nothing left of my sister but another vacant face in a white robe, another voice in the eternal chorus. I broke from the tree line and ran toward the platform. "Emma!" I screamed, though my voice seemed muted compared to the overwhelming hum of the assembly. "Emma, come back!" The humming faltered slightly as some of the figures turned toward me. Their faces showed mild curiosity, as if I was an unexpected but not unwelcome addition to their ceremony. Several of them stepped apart, creating a path to the platform's center, inviting me to join them. But Emma had stopped changing. My voice had interrupted whatever process was transforming her, anchoring her to the physical world through our connection. She blinked and looked around in confusion, seeing the robed figures as if for the first time. "Becca?" Her voice was thin, distant but recognizably hers. "Where? What is this place?" The humming grew more insistent, more demanding. The figures were trying to reclaim her, to complete the transformation they'd begun. Emma's form started to blur again as their song pulled at her consciousness. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the platform's edge. Her flesh felt cold and strangely insubstantial, as if she was only partially present in the physical world. The robed figures made no move to stop us, but their humming followed us as we fled into the forest. We ran blindly through the trees, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs. Behind us, the humming continued, sometimes seeming to come from the platform, sometimes from all around us. The white figures appeared between the trees, not chasing, but simply observing, waiting for Emma to voluntarily return to complete what they'd started. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached our campsite. Emma collapsed beside the RV, her body shaking with exhaustion and something deeper. When she looked at me, her eyes were her own again, but haunted by memories of whatever she'd experienced on that platform. "They wanted me to stay," she whispered, "to become part of something beautiful and eternal. No more stress, no more difficult decisions, no more being alone, just harmony and purpose and belonging. But you came back. Because you called me." She gripped my hand tightly. "Your voice was the only thing that felt real anymore. Everything else was fading away." We broke camp immediately, throwing our belongings into the RV without regard for organization or inventory. As we drove away from Bear Lake, I watched the forest in the mirrors, half expecting to see white figures emerging from between the trees. Emma slept for most of the drive back to Salt Lake City, but it wasn't restful sleep. She murmured constantly in a language I didn't recognize. Not words exactly, but tonal phrases that might have been fragments of the humming we'd heard on the platform. When she woke, she had no memory of the sounds she'd made. The rental company accepted the RV without comment. though I noticed the agent wrinkle his nose slightly at a smell I couldn't identify. Something like ozone and old flowers. We caught flights back to our respective coasts that same day, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered in the Utah mountains. But distance doesn't seem to matter. Emma called me 3 weeks later, her voice thick with exhaustion and fear. "I'm sleepwalking again," she said, "every night. And Becca, I'm not alone." She'd been waking to find her apartment windows open and dirt on her bare feet, as if she'd been walking outside for hours. Her neighbors reported seeing her in the building's rooftop garden, standing motionless among the plants and humming softly to herself. Security cameras showed her leaving the building at various times during the night, always returning before dawn with no memory of where she'd been. "But the worst part," she continued, "is that I'm starting to see them during the day too. The white figures. They're here in Baltimore, standing in crowds, sitting in the hospital cafeteria, walking through the parking garage. Always watching, always waiting." I tried to convince her it was stress, delayed trauma from our camping experience, something treatable with therapy and medication. But late that night I woke to find my own apartment windows open and sand between my toes, despite living on the 4th floor of a downtown Los Angeles high-rise. The humming had followed us home. Now, 6 months later, I understand what's happening. The platform in the forest wasn't just a meeting place, it was a recruitment center. The white figures weren't trying to harm Emma. They were trying to save her, to save all of us, because the world is full of people like my sister and me, stressed, isolated, searching for purpose and connection in an increasingly fragmented society. The collective consciousness that hums on that ancient platform offers something we desperately need: belonging without judgment, purpose without ambition, harmony without conflict. All we have to do is let go of our individual selves and join the eternal song. Emma stopped fighting it 2 weeks ago. She left Baltimore without notice, driving west toward Utah with a peaceful smile I hadn't seen since before medical school. Her last text message consisted of coordinates, latitude and longitude that correspond to a location in the mountains near Bear Lake. I should report her missing. I should call the authorities and organize a search party, but I know they won't find her, because she doesn't want to be found. She's finally discovered a place where the stress and pressure and constant decision-making can't touch her. The humming is getting stronger. I hear it in traffic noise, in air conditioning hums, in the whisper of wind through my apartment's windows. Sometimes I catch glimpses of white figures standing at bus stops or walking through shopping centers, their faces serene and purposeful. They're not just in Utah anymore. They're everywhere, recruiting others who are ready to trade their individual consciousness for collective peace. The song is spreading, carried by those who've heard it and been changed by it. I bought a plane ticket to Salt Lake City yesterday. One way. I told myself it was to find Emma, to bring her home, to save her from whatever cult or psychological break has claimed her. But that's not really why I'm going. I'm going because the humming has become beautiful instead of frightening, because the white figures no longer look alien but familiar, like old friends waiting patiently for me to remember who I really am. I'm going because Emma was right. We don't have to carry the weight of individual existence anymore. There's a place in the mountains where stress and loneliness and difficult decisions simply cease to matter. A place where we can finally belong to something larger than ourselves. The flight leaves tomorrow morning. By tomorrow night, I'll be back at Bear Lake, following the trail into the mountains where the platform waits and the eternal song continues. Emma will be there, I know. Not as my sister anymore, but as part of the harmony that connects all things. She'll help me take the last few steps, help me add my voice to the chorus that grows stronger with each new member. I can hardly wait to stop being Rebecca Walsh and become something beautiful instead. The humming is so clear now, so welcoming, so close to perfect.